retake the table, and we chatted a little earlier, and we're going to start this one with you, Maria, because the term social investment must have been mentioned 10 times by other speakers today. But before we go down the panel to get views from others, can you just give us a little bit about ImpactLab and also a definition of social investment so we know what we're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, tēnā koutou katoa, talofa lava, manuia le aso. It's great to be here. And yeah, probably a few people are wondering, what the heck is social investment? People are talking about it. So I guess ImpactLab was really founded and created to bring the tools of social investment, particularly to the community. And it was founded out of some analysis that came out of government, which basically looked at, over the lifetime of every New Zealander, what does each of our interactional journeys with government look like, and how much investment actually happens in our lives. And that analysis showed that about 15% of New Zealanders actually use half of all government social services, excluding superannuation, over their lifetime. And those are the New Zealanders with the most complex lives, about 700,000 or so people. And the Productivity Commission has recently described it as people who are living in persistent disadvantage, so facing barriers in terms of poverty, social exclusion, and lack of access to essentials like health and housing that prevent people being able to even form hopes for the future and to be able to go after those. So the question really is, how do we make our investment work for New Zealanders, and particularly for those who most need services that are effective at supporting their aspirations? So in terms of social investment as a toolkit, we really see it as, I guess, a set of principles for approaching investing and changing lives. And I think what's really interesting is these principles can be applied right through the system, from the level of a minister signing off $1 billion policy package, right through to a social worker sitting with a whānau talking about their priorities for this week. So those principles are, firstly, taking a customer focus. So that's really about, rather than expecting customers to adapt themselves to social services, adapting the services to the needs of those customers. So for example, ImpactLab worked with a digital literacy charity that shared with us that there had been a very well-funded government initiative in the far north to help give kids access to laptops and technology who didn't have it. But after about a year, only 20 kids had enrolled in this program. And when they asked why, it turned out the form for signing up for the program, the first page of it asked about financial details, and it looked like a bank form. And a lot of the whānau they were trying to reach had debt problems, so they did not want to go near that form. So they then redesigned the whole onboarding process, and they were able to reach over 240 kids in the next 12-month period. So taking a customer focus is that first principle. The second is taking an investment-based framework to decision-making. And I would say probably the traditional social services funding framework is cost-based. So we report on how much money we spent, and we stop there. An investment framework is about saying not just what's the cost, but what's the value from an investment perspective for these people's lives in the long term. So ImpactLab worked recently with a community housing provider that houses people with severe and persistent mental health needs. And when we looked at data from the former DHB for their area, for those tenants, we saw that in the 5 years before they got tailored and appropriate housing, those tenants had an average of 100 nights a year that they were spending in hospital. So a third of those people's lives they were spending in a hospital bed, and many of them in forensic units because they'd committed crimes related to their mental health, which I know, James, you were talking about earlier. So that was the before picture. But then after these people got appropriate housing, the average number of nights they spent in hospital in the next year was 10. So it dropped from 100 to 10, and it stayed low for the next 5 years. So we were able to calculate that saves that DHB $5 million. And when we look at the impact on those tenants' lives in terms of their mental health, their physical wellness, their stability of tenure, their academic engagement of their children, we saw that there's a 4x return on the dollars spent, spending more to appropriately house those people. So shifting from cost to value through an investment framework is the second thing. And then the third principle is feedback thinking. So once we know this, if we can know not just that we spent some money, but who did we reach, how did the investment make a difference to their lives, and what does that mean for the long-term ability of those people to achieve their aspirations, what are we going to do with that knowledge? And so a core part of social investment is getting a feedback loop going where we can use the information flow to improve the next set of decisions. And really the core of what we do at ImpactLab is work with NGOs, government and businesses to get that feedback loop going within their own organisations. So far we've worked with over 250 organisations. We've measured the long-term impact, or estimated it really, of about $600 million of investment. And I think there's real opportunity to get that loop reaching further up into the bureaucracy to guide the decisions that happen at the policy level.
Brilliant, thank you. Thanks, Maria. Merepeka,
Thank you.
please.
Thank you. Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Merepeka Raukawa-Tait ahau, no te waka o te arawa. Tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. First of all, I welcome the opportunity today to have a conversation with you about social investment. And I say that because I think, well, thank God somebody is starting to cotton on, because it's been a long time coming, and so I welcome the opportunity to share with you what social investment is. And it's not rocket science. It is investing in the potential of our whānau. It is as simple as that. And so we like to complicate things. And for the last 10, and I see Lady Moxham here today, for the last 20 years, some of us have been out there actually doing social investment. And that's why we believe in the potential of our whānau. And if you don't believe in the potential of your whānau, then we will continue to invest as we have been doing since Mai Rāno, for the last long time. And so it is a time that we think we change our thinking in terms of our whānau that come to be supported at the time that is most necessary for them. And I chair the Whānau Order Commissioning Agency and have done so for the past 10 years. So when I see the statistics go up, and when I hear people talk about Māori whānau, then that is the work that I do. That is the work that Lady Moxham does. So we're not talking about somewhere out there, people out there. That is the daily grind that the providers, over 100 of them up and down the country, do. And we love to have conversations with people such as you, who know it all. Because we constantly hear about growing the economy, the need to grow the economy. Well, what we say is, hang on a moment, let's start growing the people of Aotearoa. Let's start growing that large growing sector of whānau who need to be included, who must have a place in the ongoing development of Aotearoa. And so that's our mahi. And so it was well over a dozen years ago that we thought, we're not going to continue to say that our people are mad, bad or sad. We must look to their potential, and we must fund on their potential. We must make sure that we invest long-term for transformational change that will make a difference for the whānau. 77% of the whānau order providers are Māori-owned. We're Māori-owned, our boards are Māori, our executive are Māori, the staff are Māori, and the client group are Māori. So it's by Māori, for Māori, with Māori. Nothing less, nothing less. Because it's about trust. That's the other thing. It's about trust. And I hear so many people talk about what they want to do and support, and I understand that, to shift the dial for our whānau. But unless you can get in the door, unless you are the face that is seen, the face that is respected, the face that is known, the person that suspends judgment, then you won't make a difference. And it'll be the continuation of money going down a big black hole that is the social welfare spend. So I absolutely are such a supporter of social investment. We call it whānau investment. We get alongside our whānau. They underpin everything that we do. They inform everything that we do. Otherwise, we're just thinking, oh, well, this is what they need. Hey, have we got a deal for you? Have a look at this product. Have a look at this. And that's not what they need. And the one thing you'll find about people now is that they walk. If you can't provide what they need at the time that they need it most by the people who are trusted, then whānau walk. And sadly, that costs Aotearoa considerable dollars. So the time for wasted spend is over. The time for having the right people advising the government, developing the policies, making sure you don't fund for the continued dismal statistics that we always have. The time is right now with a new government who I believe are receptive to new ways. I heard that this morning from the Deputy Prime Minister. Wants to look for new things to do. Wants to cut the waste of spending, and I certainly do. And I wouldn't hesitate, if I was the Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister, to go through and see where some of the dollars are currently going. There should be no sacred cows. Everything should be on the table. And if the statistics have not improved in the last 3 to 5 years or a dozen years, then bang, they're out. Move over for people who can do the job. Because that's how dire it is in Aotearoa. So we've got economists looking at growing the economy. And I'm saying hand in hand when growing the economy goes hand in hand in growing the people who need to be part of the future of Aotearoa. They need to see a place for themselves. The poor. Somebody said to me the other day, I didn't sell off the state houses, Merepeka, but I'd love to be able to get into a warm house. So what we do when we talk to our families, and I'm sure you're not surprised about this, a dozen years ago, we said, what is it that you want? And they said, well, actually, Merepeka, we'd like to live well. I said, well, come on, I'll tease that out a bit. What does that mean? Well, we'd like a nice home. We'd like a warm home. We'd like some good jobs so that we can support our whānau. We'd like to have easy access to affordable health care. It's nothing more or less than what you and I want. And that's quite simple. So why on earth do we continue to fund one-off programs, usually a pilot, and if it's successful, move it on, move it out. And people, the result of that is that people get impacted. And then after a while, they say, we don't want anything to do with what's currently being provided. And then we say, oh, well, they're not willing to come on board. In fact, most families who are experiencing difficulty are. So if we want transformational change, then we need to change the mindset of the people who are actually ensuring that there is sufficient funding and investment going into where it's needed. We need to have the right people there. We need to think intergenerationally, long term, and we need to support the people and I believe say to them that you are important. You are important to the future of Aotearoa. This is not an A team and a B team in Aotearoa. Everybody has the right to say, I want to play a part, and my children to have a great future in our great country. So Lady Moxham and I have been doing that work for the last 20 years. And I'm so pleased, Maria, and to see you also, Professor, that you're also supportive of social investment. For us, it is investing in the potential of our whānau. And it has to be done by the right people, supported by the government, and hopefully the economists will do their figures and see the value of it as well. We have our own researchers, our own data, because we never trust what's coming out of the government. Kia ora. Sorry, Maria.
Kia ora, Merepeka. Michael, as an economist, what's your take? You're welcome.
It's a hard act to follow. I want to pick up on a couple of points that were made earlier in the day. So Minister Willis gave us 4 words that I think pretty much sum up social investment to me. We can do better. And I think that really gets to the heart of what social investment is about. We can do better. And Professor Gorman sort of trumped me a little bit in terms of my comments, because he said some of the things that I was going to say, which was, it's about generating the most value from the least cost, because that's how I see things. It's about cost effectiveness. It's about generating the most good from what we spend, because we have a limited We have a limited amount that we can spend on social outcomes, and we want to be able to do the best that we can with that. And you might sit there and think, well, Professor Cameron, you're just an economist, and that's what all economists say. So let me just finish with a couple of quotes from non-economists on that point. Toby Ord, he's a philosopher and ethicist, he's Australian. He is very much in favour of cost effectiveness. He says when you've got a limited budget, cost effectiveness is the right thing to do. You generate the most good from what you're spending. Hans Rosling, who is a medical physician, some of you might know him as the founder of the Gapminder website. He said that cost effectiveness is the most compassionate thing that we can do. And I think that those are important points. But I want to come back to that. We can do better because we do need to interrogate what we mean by better. And that's the challenge that we probably most face, is in working out how can we measure what it is that we're doing, how can we work out what it is that the right outcomes are, how we measure them, and how we ensure that we're getting better for what we're spending.
Kia ora, thanks, Michael. All right, there's a few questions come in, but I first want to dive into a little bit of mechanics about how this works. So, Maria, I've seen some of your reports. I was looking at one of the Whānau Auto reports on an innovative education program. I think it's easy for anybody in the room to think about what somebody might be spending. You know, here was a program that cost $1 million, it cost $500,000. How, in a practical sense, does it work to then say, the case of less nights in an emergency department, okay, we can probably cost that. How, in a practical sense, might an agency, public or private, think about the value of human potential, of whānau potential, as you've spoken about, Merepeka, the value of reduced mental anguish? How do you do that to come up with a figure that says this is worth 2x, 3x, 4x the investment?
Yeah, so we've spent about 4 years on that, and the data people in the room will not be surprised to learn we're still a far, far way from where we want to get to. But our ultimate view is to improve the data, we have to use what we have. So we work with a lot of really small charities. There might be a team of 5 plus 20 volunteers who are now doing a better job answering that question than what ministers have access to when making $100 million funding decisions. And that's just because of the ability we now have to use technology to collapse the cost of accessing and analysing data. So what kind of data are we looking at? Well, obviously there's the cost side. I would say 90% of the 250 organisations we've worked with so far that are delivering social services have never calculated their cost per person or their cost per family. So that financial data is sitting there, but they're not actually asked for it. So I wouldn't underestimate the usefulness of simply looking at the cost, which most organisations don't do on a per person level. Then in terms of the value, we look at a couple of drivers. So it's really about who are you reaching and what's the opportunity to make a difference for those people? What kind of outcomes matter to those people and what's the impact if you can achieve them? And how effective do we think a certain intervention can be at achieving those things? So from an opportunity perspective, that's really about understanding the past. What's been the story of the people that you're working with prior to the point that they've met your service or the service that you're funding? So for example, in the case of that community housing provider I mentioned, we've got people who are spending 100 days a year in hospital. Now, a mental health service working with the student who's stressed about exams has a very different opportunity in relation to the kind of mental health challenge they're experiencing. So that's the first kind of data. Then the second kind of data is, in terms of the present, what's the effectiveness of the thing that you're actually doing? And there we work to try and figure out, well, what actually is the intervention? Because we find often government agencies don't actually know what the thing is that they're funding in terms of how someone experiences a service. And what reasons do we have to believe people are engaging with it? So we worked recently with a phone line for people with money trouble. And when we looked at the data, we found that 60% of people who called the line didn't stay on long enough to get meaningful help of any kind. But those people are being counted in the stats as engaging, but they're not actually. So understanding from an operational perspective, are the parents turning up to the first week of the parenting course and dropping out, or are they staying for the 30 weeks? So that's the second kind of data. In the present, what does engagement look like? And then the third kind is, well, what are the outcomes that we're trying to aim for here, and what's the value if we can achieve them? That's the hardest bit. That's the bit the economists will want to debate about the most, because of course there's a million different angles for valuing positive change. And we've kind of come to the place I think a few speakers have mentioned, which is what matters most is what outcomes are whānau prioritising, and then how can we get some view of whether those are happening. So we partnered with a Pacific whānau order provider where they had worked with families, identified some unsurprising outcome areas, like we want housing, we want our kids educated, and we want to be healthy. And then we could layer in a whole lot of proxy data from academia and from government to understand, well, can we see educational engagement or attainment increasing? And if it can increase, what's the impact on family income? What's the impact on the fiscal cost for government of reduction in welfare liability? What's the impact on health of being employed? So we just stack those up, and in our case, we monetize that to a dollar figure, which we call social return on investment, so that we can compare it to the cost that went in. So you can sort of see it's a very imperfect process, but if we're starting from zero confidence and no information, the challenge I give my team, including Mari, who's here today, is how do we build up confidence or test our assumptions to improve the investment decision? Sorry, that was a long answer.
Don't worry, we're at an economics forum. You go. And Michael, you've probably got some thoughts on the data, but hold that, because I want to come back to you on some of those data questions in a minute. Merepeka, I'm going to pass to you. You spoke about the team. They are out there engaging with whānau every day. As you say, this is not theoretical. It's just what the work is day to day. You've also talked, and Maria, you have too, that often what we're talking about is people with exceptionally complex lives. Things aren't always going well, and that's a combination of a lot of different factors. It might be housing, education, health. How do you take a model like that and scale it? How do you, I think it might be a 90 or 100 staff that you talked out there, the scale of the challenge is so big. How do you take that data-informed view, but also the relational view, and do that at a greater scale?
Well, it is about relationships, there's no doubt about that. And we have to look at the total whānau when we're supporting our whānau. If you're just going to say, well, there's an issue with housing, and focus on addressing that without addressing everything else that's happening in that whānau, you won't get very far. So to scale up, you have to work with the whānau, and the whānau themselves eventually become, I suppose you could say, I won't use role model, but they become the influencer on the rest of their whānau themselves. Whānau see the changes that are made, albeit initially they might be quite small, but whānau see the change that is made, and then they start to think about where can they access the services that might support them, who's providing the services, and so you can scale up in that regard. And the other thing too is we can't do it all on our own, so we look to collaborate with other providers within the communities up and down the country. And also there are some significant government agencies now that is coming along and saying, we want to talk to you about what you're doing and see if we can support you. And that's another mechanism by which we can scale up too. The problem, I think, is always that government agencies look for a quick return. And in the past, they think short term, they fund short term, and basically the outcomes are short term. We can't afford that any longer. We have to think long term, intergenerational, and we've got to have the players and the commitment from people to be able to stay the distance as well. I want to say that the people who work as providers out in our communities, most of them are not really valued, and that saddens me because they do work that so many people wouldn't do, and oftentimes it's quite dangerous work. And we need to appreciate that they are a mine of information, and they are now feeding information into us so that we can very quickly see what's trending, what we need to get advice to the Minister as soon as possible, or where we need to collaborate more with others up and down the country. So there's potential to scale up and do a lot more, but it does require people, first of all, to trust each other, and you only trust people that you've developed a relationship with and that you're prepared to actually look at things in a different way. And it should be led by the government. And thank you, Maria, for the mahi that you're doing, and with the NGOs particularly. But when we're talking about social investment, it should be led by the government, because the government should see the value of the return that they will get. And we certainly know it. And if they have difficulty with that, then we'll just survive as an Aotearoa, but we're not going to thrive. And we should be demanding that we thrive now.
Word. It strikes me listening to that, you talked about coordination, collaboration. This does seem like an enormous coordination problem, because as I listen to you all speak, I'm thinking about running something like the justice system, or the health system, as we heard this morning, or the education system. They're enormous bureaucracies with all of the challenges that those have, and I don't use bureaucracy negatively. You're just trying to get a lot of complex stuff done. How do you then coordinate across those agencies? Because obviously housing needs to connect to education, to health and so on. Maria, what could happen better in the background for the coordination of those agencies?
So my thinking on that has evolved from talking to thousands of frontline leadership teams. I used to think we needed to change how governments organise to coordinate, but having observed the challenges of that against the kind of magnetic forces of bureaucracy, which aren't really the fault of the people in it, it's just the way it works. I think if we try and get government to reorganise in a coordinated way, we're going to be waiting a long time to get the kind of results that Merepeka is describing. I think at the front line we can coordinate. So really simple example, the Loft in Christchurch, they basically took 16 existing agencies and service providers spread throughout the city and put them in one mall and put them literally right next to each other. So whānau can come in while they're doing their shopping at the mall and roll through, give their information once and get all of the services. I know of similar models, for example, in disability, which are currently struggling to be funded because they're viewed as too expensive. But from a data perspective, we see the return is a lot greater than forcing whānau to spend all their time travelling around when they can't really afford to and don't have time to because they just don't engage. So I think we should aim for coordination at the frontline level, and I think with the right incentives and support, frontline providers, whether they be government agencies or not NGOs, can do that. But I think at a kind of further up the chain level, it's more about taking a population-based approach to funding. And the opportunity we have there is we have government departments that have a natural constituency of a population that they can focus on. So whaikaha for disability, or the tamariki going through state care through Oranga Tamariki. So we've got a department that has a clear remit of a population. Then from a procurement perspective, they can focus on how they fund coordinated frontline initiatives. It doesn't require reorganising the whole government, but it does require saying, we're going to spend another $10,000 per kid on this hub-based approach that provides holistic multidisciplinary care instead of the status quo of it not being joined up. Because from a population perspective, we can see that those kids are much more likely to be able to get a good start in the education system by taking that approach, especially the ones who face the most barriers to doing it. So I think it's about population-based procurement that incentivises frontline cooperation, which, by the way, a lot of NGOs we meet want to do, but they're simply not incentivised and not funded to.
I'm pleased that the answer was first we reorganise how government works and then we get into it. It's positive. Merepeka?
Yes, I just wanted to add that for some reason we have this unshakable belief that government departments deliver quality. You know, I mean, I can't believe it. In this day and age, we still have this unshakable belief. I mean, they do okay, but that's the benchmark, for God's sake. That's what we've settled for. And it's to have a discussion, then we need to be able to have that free and frank discussion to say, well, who else is out there that can do better than what we've currently had for the last 2 decades? And we're not really, sometimes I think we're just not honest enough or truthful enough, or we're so wedded to the idea that the government is it, that we just can't get away from that. And I have to say that most of the Māori providers that we support and work alongside, we say that benchmark is too low, it's never really achieved, and so we'll have to set out and, with government support, and again I come back to the government, but the government should be devolving itself of so much of this mahi now, because the results have been abysmal.
So I'm going to pick up on the results and loop back to you, Michael, on some data questions. You've been engaged in analysis and policy discussions around many social interventions, things like harm from alcohol and so on. One thing I'm thinking here, so if I put my black hat on, I could imagine this spawning an industry of competitive assumption makers, whereby the group that can come up with the best rationalisation for the largest number and cell C8 in the spreadsheet gets the contract because they've demonstrated that it's the housing rather than the education that's going to make the difference. How do you think we can navigate through that such that we're making the kind of impacts we want to without it essentially getting tied up in competitive assumption making?
Yeah, I think we're always going to face that risk that whoever comes up with the best numbers is going to get the best press, they're going to get the best contracts and so on. But I think the way that we negotiate our way through that, the way that we can avoid those problems or at least minimise them is through transparency. I think that we need to be very transparent about the data that we're using. We need to be very transparent about the methods that we're employing, the assumptions that we're using when we're calculating something like social return on investment, so that others can also interrogate those numbers and we can get a sense of their limitations, a sense of where they may have made faulty assumptions, where we can, I guess, coming back to where I started, we can do better. We can do better not only in terms of our social spending, but in terms of the way that we measure and the way that we evaluate.
And would you, just to double click on that, would you see, and others may have a view on this, if we think about this as a coordination and allocation challenge for government, but also for other organisations, would you favour an agency? It might be Treasury, it might be a new, don't know what it's called, Department of Regulation. Would you favour one group providing the neutral view on that? Is it Maria's organisation? How do you think about doing that in the best way to get the best outcomes?
I think there's already certainly capability. Treasury has some, other agencies have some as well. I don't think that we should concentrate that capability in one location, in one organisation. I think because social spending is spread across so many organisations that there should be capability in all of those organisations to some extent. But again, coming back to what I said before, if we are transparent about how we are calculating things, how we are evaluating, then having multiple organisations doing that and able to, I guess, cross-check against what others are doing, I think that's an appropriate way to move forward.
Thank you. Any other views?
Yeah, I think it makes sense to have a common data infrastructure that's as accessible as possible, not just to agencies within government, but also to community organisations. Because there's a lot of there'll be a lot of commonality to the questions people are asking and to the data sources they need. And again, there's an opportunity to layer analytics tools that makes it as simple as possible to work with what can be really unwieldy data sets. And I have to give a shout out to the Stats NZ team managing the integrated data infrastructure, the IDI, who I think do a pretty good job of looking for opportunities to improve the infrastructure that everyone benefits from. And I think it's an area government has underinvested in the last few years, but if they can invest in it, it improves it for everyone. I also think it's pretty critical that we have sort of neutral intermediaries sitting between government and the community sector because of the funder-fundee relationship. We really noticed that it's much easier to get organisations to create space for hard conversations when they're not worried about the funder seeing that they're not doing as well on something as they thought they were. And I also think really promising the likes of organisations like Merepeka's who are developing their own capability, because if we can get other like iwi and community organisations up the data maturity curve, then they can do the inquiry that they need for their decision making, which will be unique to them in their context. And agree around transparency, that's critical.
Thank you. There's a question here which I'm going to take and then edit. So there was a question, and I'll pass this to you, Merepeka, around what would we say to people who believe being on some sort of benefit can create a dependency? But I'm going to pull back from that and ask a more general question, which is around the notion of individuals or whānau getting stuck, dependent or just in a situation where they cannot move themselves to that situation of living well, warm home, meaningful work. There won't be a single one, obviously, every situation is unique. What are the most promising interventions, activities that you have seen that have helped whānau get unstuck, to achieve or get out of a situation, either of dependency or just into that path where they can start becoming that role model, if you like? What's working?
The one thing that always works is that somebody will take the time to sit down with them and listen. And that's really very simple. And most times, particularly if you work for a government department, the clock's ticking, get in, get out, and here you are, here's a range of, and it might not at all be what they require. So if we would just commit to sitting down and listening and then saying, as simple as, what are the 3 things that would help you the most? And then you get a picture that it's not the housing, perhaps. It's that I need to get to my oncology appointment every second week, and my eldest daughter has to stay home, and now the school is on top of me. So it's, and if nobody's sitting down and talking, that's just one example. So, and that is what our providers who work day by day, every day with the whānau, and they start to build up a picture, and then you really start to get a sense of the overwhelming, I guess you could say, the overwhelming environment in which that family is having to cope day by day. And it's not easy stuff. And, it isn't easy. And while I can have a crack from time to time and get very impatient with government agencies, I do know that if you haven't taken the time, there will be no trust. And then people just, after a while, they tend to give up and hope fades. And that's the worst thing for our families to experience. When hope is gone, they shut down, their kids don't go to school, they don't bother if there's not enough to eat in the house. And that's reality for thousands of New Zealanders today. I'm not talking hundreds, I'm talking thousands. Thousands of our children don't go to school. They've got parents who love them, but their home situation has become so overwhelmed that the energy has been zapped, and then the people who do come to talk with them just don't have the time. And so I would say that's the first thing. And also, you need somebody, I believe, who is known within that community. We always say the face that is seen, not the one that just comes here for 3 months and is gone. The face that is seen, that is constantly seen, then again, the trusting relationship is built up. But it takes time. It takes time.
Thank you. There's a couple of investment questions here. One, I'll start Maria, but others may with you. Somebody asked what the panel think about the idea of opening a social investment fund or social investment more generally to private investors and capital. Have you considered that and pros and cons?
Yeah, so we work with a lot of private philanthropists and kind of community-based philanthropic institutions, and I think there's a lot of desire there, basically, to improve things in the community. So I think, I could see there being interest in that kind of vehicle, particularly if it enables more significant funding allocation. Like I'm thinking a lot of philanthropists we meet, they're interested in supporting housing solutions, but they just don't have the capital to play in that space. So I think from a demand perspective, there would be interest. And then, I mean, from our perspective, we kind of feel agnostic, I suppose, as to where the funding comes from, because we just know, I've got a list in my head of 60 NGOs that if I could give them $10,000 more today, I know they would be able to change a family's life, but they don't have that $10,000. So I think anything that can kind of crowd in capital, but in a way that it can be allocated with a feedback loop around it is a good thing.
A lot of different angles and questions coming in on this. I'm just conscious of time. I think I might go to the closing question and give you a couple of minutes each with the magic governance wand. So much of what you say when I think the room hears you talk about it makes absolute sense. There's a strong investment case if you want to look at it in a hard numbers or dollars sense. There's a huge ethical and moral case. I think there's a greater long-term case, and yet some of these things are not happening. So can you each give us a couple of minutes on what you think may be the barriers, but then what you would like to see? So you're running the ship for the next 2 or 3 election cycles. What would you implement across the country to implement some of these changes? And I'll start with you, Michael.
I think probably the biggest challenge is political economy. And I think we've found ourselves in a situation when we have a change of government that the incoming group seems determined to first unwind everything that the previous group had done. And not everything that the previous group had put in place was bad, just because you disagree with it. And I think we need to be a little bit more, concede a little bit to the other side, that some things are good and should be retained. But in order to do that, we need to actually be evaluated. We need to know which things are working so that we can keep the things that are working. We need to not be afraid to get rid of the things that are not working, and through that process, things will get better.
Thank you. Merepeka.
I think the mindset needs to change. The mindset of people who are in leadership positions, and this isn't just the government. It's everybody having a look to see what can their contribution be to moving significant numbers of New Zealanders to a better place. So the mindset has to change. We do have to see the potential in people. We do have to, as I said before, this business about the A team and the B team and thinking that there'll always be numbers parked up on the sideline. What we don't ever talk about is the true cost to Aotearoa when we leave thousands of people parked up on the sideline to say, well, they'll get by, but there is a significant cost to New Zealand. But it's the mindset that has to change. And I do believe that there can be private sector involvement. I really do. I think there's some great leaders in the private sector who, if they were only asked, but we never ask them because we think, well, what would they want? Well, they want what most of us want, a fantastic country. So that would be something that I'd like to see.
Kia ora, thank you. Maria.
I think for me, I think of it like there's a micro level and a macro level. At the micro level, we shouldn't underestimate how much is possible by simply enabling frontline organisations to do an incrementally better job over time. So I think that's the barrier there is frontline organisations of all sizes being able to access the kind of analytics toolkit that helps them understand where their investment's going, who they're reaching, the difference they're already making, and also where there might be opportunities to do even more. And to bring those business cases to their funders. The business case to invest the 100 grand in marketing to reach 30% more kids with mental health issues, which is an example we saw last week. So I think just making the tools available at the front line is critical. We're seeing big uptake of these tools by the larger NGOs who can afford it, but we need funders to come to the party to enable access to the smaller ones. And that means shifting our focus from being project funding to actually flexible funding that organisations can spend on their IT and analytics capability. So that's what I'd say at the micro level. At the macro level, I think it's kind of step one is use the information that we already have. And as I said, I think the agencies that have a natural population that they exist for and can focus on, the toolkit's sitting there now for them to use, and I know in parts of government it is being picked up. So use that to better understand your customers, the people that you're trying to make a difference for, and where your current spending is going in relation to that. I think back to, one of the early social investment exercises, way before my time, in government, where they unpacked that MSD welfare liability, and they found this group of people who were some of the longest term kind of welfare recipients, which was single men with schizophrenia and other major mental health conditions living alone in places like boarding houses. And shockingly, what they found was that group were receiving almost no government services. So one of the most in-need groups receiving almost no investment in support to improve their lives, other than the acute end of hospital. So I think using what you already have to understand your population and identify where those gaps and needs are would be an amazing starting point, because what we're learning is once the information's there and we're looking at it, it's kind of a catalyst for change, because it raises the next 10 questions, like who are these guys? Where are they? Who has a relationship of trust with them? Can we go and ask them what it is that they need? What kind of services should we be giving them access to, and why can't they access them? We've got to get on that line of inquiry, and fortunately we have amazing policy people in New Zealand who have the capability to do that, and now they have the toolkit, so let's do it.
Great close. All right, look, we are at time. This has been a fascinating discussion. I think we're all a little bit wiser now, which is part of the goal of being here. So I ask you to put your hands together for our fantastic panel. Cool. Thank you all. Thank you. All right, and tēnā koe, welcome Jim, arrived for the coffee. That was a fantastic discussion. We are going to go into a short break now for about 20 minutes until 3 o'clock. Just previewing after that, next session will be at 3, back here on trade, dealing with a divided world. Professor Anna Strutt will lead that. We'll go straight into that from the last session of the day around monetary policy, which Stephen Joyce will be leading, and of course that precedes our discussion or presentation from Reserve Bank Governor Adrian Orr, which is over breakfast tomorrow, so that's a double header if you're into monetary policy. And a reminder, of course, we'll wrap up after 5 and join people for a drink. So break now for about 20 minutes, and if we can all be seated again at 3 o'clock. Thank you.